Hey guys, I'm V for Verbatim and I see dead people. Or maybe... yeah, no, that's just my disheveled ass in the mirror. My bad. Today I'm doing another redraw, this time with a concept more than a story. And what is that concept exactly? Oh, it's pretty wholesome actually. Death. Or what happens after. I came up with two versions of an afterlife, and admittedly, the older version I'm working with today was a little more depressing before revisions, but we're just going to be doing a few characters today. Characters I was tentatively calling Guardians of Souls, 7 children of various ages and homeworlds that collect the souls of the dead. Yes, we're officially getting into other alien species now. It's a lot of half-baked ideas, which to me seems like a lot of room for potential. So without further ado, let's talk about what really happens when man's best friend goes to a farm upstate in my world. So this story isn't really much of a story, but here we go. In the realm of the dead, there are 3 guardians that manage souls of the deceased. The foreman, a character not much more than a concept that is in charge of the other 2, Death, the figurehead of the death realm, and Mr. Bones, the guy that does all the paperwork and handles the business side of things. They're all mysterious in their own ways, being skeletons-ish, but with no real names, no known motivations, and possibly no souls. Death's a confused creature. They act sporadically, speaking with hundreds of whispering voices, and either treating the newly deceased gently, or brutally depending on what voice has control. They usually guard the vault, where every soul enters and is locked away, but sometimes they wander off to follow Mr. Bones or lingering spirits, letting souls escape from time to time. Mr. Bones, by contrast, has always been this super blunt guy, very business savvy, very competent, the type that knows how to close deals. The deals in question: getting people to die when he needs them to, with soul contracts. Soul contracts are only physical in the death realm, but they represent the idea that fate or coincidence will kill a person at a specific time. Think about freak accidents like in Final Destination, or a historical example, a bullet seemingly curving to hit JFK. That's what soul contracts do to any unwilling parties involved. The time and death dimension are connected, so Mr. Bones' contracts are based on maintaining a steady passage of time with few anomalies. Mr. Bones generally treats people as dispensable, not out of malicious intent, but because people really are dispensable in his eyes. He does, however, act friendly towards those he finds fascinating, and they in turn either soften his heart or harden it further. Clara, a woman who lingered in the dimension of the dead after her death, became friends with Mr. Bones and helped him become more compassionate. Another acquaintance of his is Max Astral, since he basically offered Mr. Bones his siblings' souls on a silver platter and has killed hundreds more since. The two get along because of their mutual desire to consider immoral actions necessary for business, and Mr. Bones occasionally bends the rules for Max. He isn't good or evil, he's just his weird bony self. The death realm itself is nothingness. It's flat, dark, with souls lighting the realm like faint purple orbs. Ghosts exist in many forms. Some are very willing to enter the afterlife, others refuse to accept death and become unstable, wayward souls if not dealt with, while others are anomalies, or half-ghosts. They exist in a state between life and death, so they cannot be taken to where all souls go, the massive vaults that death guards. Despite this, I still like to believe that there is a heaven beyond the vault, so the vault is more of an in-between space when people are unaware until they enter heaven, whatever form that may take. As for the characters we're going to discuss today, one's alive, some are dead, and some are half-ghosts Mr. Bones picked up over the years to help him with collecting souls. Let's take a look at what we're working with, shall we? They're not very interesting silhouette-wise, but I will say I put a lot more effort into these guys to make them look more unique anatomy-wise. And for reference, these drawings are from when I was 13. As you can probably tell, it took me a while before what I drew was objectively acceptable art-wise. I'm still working on that even now. Starting from the left, we have Mr. Bones and the half-ghost girl I mentioned before, listed here as Luminous. She goes by Clara, Ghost Jay, Frost Queen, a few things. She's a reluctant soul collector for several years, but she was originally a hero before ending up with Mr. Bones for some reason. Mr. Bones is also here. The earliest drawing of him was from 7th grade, and despite my efforts, I've never really been able to make him as interesting to look at as the original drawing. It was bad, but there was at least interesting stuff to look at. Then we have Era, who collects the souls of fallen soldiers. She died in combat at some point. She's a Phantamu, which I'll explain in her redraw later. Nato and Neko are twins who were conjoined at birth. Nato was the parasitic twin that ended up killing them both, and he feels responsible for what happened, while Neko is more distant and stoic about the whole thing. Nato collects deceased souls, while Neko collects the souls of dead children. There is a Kali, a desert planet species that collects energy from the sun. Wick is the collector of deprived souls, whether that means emotional neglect, starvation, or death in poor housing conditions. He cares for those that were treated unfairly. His species never had a name, but I did establish that he died of starvation. Watch is another human. He became brain dead at some point, and once his machines were shut off, he died with his eyes open. His eyes never shut in death, but he can't see anything and he sometimes forgets that he's dead. He collects brain-dead souls, which is a little too specific now that I think about it. We're just gonna ignore him. I don't know what he was. And Kano, one of my favorites. He's a Benega, a skeleton alien that's the last of his species. He's the only living member of this little death parade. He had evil intentions initially, but he saw the error of his ways and surrendered himself to Mr. Bones in exchange for a way to continue his species, which, as you can see here, worked out for him. He's been with Mr. Bones the longest, excluding Clara, and is treated as an equal to Mr. Bones. So, with those basic ideas out of the way, let's get to the redraws. While we start with outline sketches, a bit of background on the inspiration for each character. I used a lot of different death symbols for this redraw, one for each minor character at least, so I'll explain each here and the main inspiration for each. Keep in mind that this is from a teenager's perspective. I'm sure there's a lot of highbrow death symbols from literature, but I don't have the time to read that one novella you liked where a stuffed badger represented a character's impending demise or something weird like that. I's an uncultured child, if you couldn't tell. Starting from the left, we've got predators. Death to most is seen as cutthroat, unapologetic, and unceremonious. The circle of life reflects this idea, so at the top of the food chain of death, predators are often stand-ins for the darker side of this cycle, especially in the form of death omens. For this first character, I used the image of a wolf to portray the less gentle side of death, based on the use of the Grimm from Harry Potter. Next, we have characters representing water, lanterns, and candles. Water, like the Veil of Death, is something we must cross at some point in our lives. With the ocean being so mysterious, cold, dark, and foreboding, it's an obvious choice to represent death. With my take on it though, I was mostly inspired by Charon, who leads souls safely across the river Styx into Hades, the underworld of Greek mythology. The character here is a guide that carries a comforting lantern. Similarly, his sibling is inspired by candles. Candles are more representative of the fleeting nature of life. They start out as beacons of wax with burning bright with life, and wax is mortality. It drips from the surface of a candle, weak against the raging life of a candle's flame. Eventually, we all burn out as we are worn down, or tragically, a gust of wind or force of nature causes our bodies to go cold. The character here is a reflection of one's physical weakness, but also carries a candle and is a similarly warm light for despairing souls as a comfort. While Mr. Bones, Kano, and Clara are not based on any specific death symbol, skeleton and demon imagery is prevalent in Mr. Bones and Kano's designs. Meanwhile, I designed Clara after a seraphim, one of the ranks of angels closest to God according to angel mythology. Gentle animals were the basis for this next character. It's my favorite take on death as someone who loves wholesome as much as gruesome. Gentle characters are associated with death to an extent, alluding to a possibility of happiness and comfort awaiting us on the other side. They can sometimes serve as comforting guardians, similar to the function of Charon as aides across the veil. This character specifically resembles an owl. An owl is as much a predator as any wolf or less friendly creature, but because of their floofy sounds and shapes, most people seem to cut them a little bit of slack and see them as much more peaceful little guys. Lastly, flowers. Flowers are a representative of the gentler side of death, a reminder that even with death and decay, life goes on. While modern takes on flower death symbols are sometimes romanticized in nature, like the fictional Hanahaki disease, I went with the use of the red poppy for Era, since she is, after all, the collector of war souls. So with the outlines almost finished, let's talk about the first character we have here, Era. Like I mentioned before, Era is a Phantamu, but what does that actually mean? Well, the Phantamu are ghost wielders. They would gather the souls of the dead and place them in jewelry that they sometimes wore. They could be used as weapons, but they were usually used for mystical and mysterious practices only the highest ranking of their species knew about. As a collective, they were blue aliens, very religious and respectable of the cycle of life and death. They had a modest empire compared to their allies, but were very well respected. Their species fell to a fast-acting virus that will come up again in later videos. They were originally all killed in the fallout, but this is where the rewrite starts. The virus killed most in the Phantamu capital and surrounding city, but many Phantamu survived on other planets and were left to fend for themselves. Without a governing system or understanding of their own religious practices, the remaining Phantamu killed each other off to steal what remained of their ghost artifacts from each other for liquidation. A mini-civil war started over this conflict, and Era was a casualty, being only 10 years old when she was enlisted. She fell in a field of poppies, and her body was surrounded in them as she decomposed. Since she was a combination of both the living and the dead, she couldn't go into the vault, and Mr. Bones trained her to help them. Drawing-wise, my goal for her was to give her more character. She was originally the eldest child under Mr. Bones, Kano and Clara, but here she's slightly younger than the conjoined twins. She wears a military uniform, and she absolutely adores her job. I still wanted it to be clear that she was made vicious from her time in battle, hence the sharp teeth. Her face is also a little off, but my explanation for this is that her lower jaw was rotted away, so her new plant ghost form is missing a jaw. She has markings on her eyes that all the Phantamu have. Her legs are also meant to resemble tree branches. What remains of her flesh is damaged, with most everything else being foliage. She wears a scythe where her hand used to be, and a peg leg where her arm once was. Since the hand can't be replaced with the flowers making up most of her body, it's just too complex of an appendage. I put an X on her forehead because it was a weapon to the head that killed her. I do something similar with each character, so I will explain that as we go. And the poppies. God, they just took me forever. Phantamu are completely bald, including women. But you can distinguish them from each other because females wear a sort of veil over their faces. Era's was lost long ago, but it was replaced with a veil of poppies she usually pushes back behind her. You don't see it until the very end, but I added a couple of sticks and twigs in there to make it look a little bit more wild. While Era is one of the Phantamu, known for their mystical connections to death and tranquility, Era is forever a child, with a hardworking, rambunctious spirit and an understanding of hardship, which makes her the perfect person to gather the souls of fallen soldiers. Watch was admittedly a little more difficult to figure out. Like Era, I aged him down significantly and made him much more of a sweetheart. His story's pretty much the same, but here's a little bit more detail. He became a vegetable after a head injury he sustained during a bike accident. He was put out of his misery by Kano as one of Kano's first collected souls, but the guy felt bad for Watch and had him help collect souls so that he could prove his worth to Mr. Bones. Mr. Bones eventually found out and allowed Watch to stay, but he became more careful about giving child assignments to Kano. Watch never touches the ground because he's scared of falling, so he flies and takes an owl-like appearance. His little cape is colored like an owl's feathers towards the end, and the overshirt he wears looks like an owl's chest feathers. Showing his past and his design was a little bit more difficult than with Era. I was thinking of an IV, but I instead went with a ventilation mask since I felt that it looks like a beak, and it gets the point across that he is an owl. You might have noticed this before, but drawing two identical eyes from a front view is very hard for me, so a lot of the time I do something with the eyes so I don't keep drawing and erasing over and over again. Call it lazy, sure, but I've torn through paper before and I don't want to do it again. Here I put an X over Watch's right eye, more emphasis on the eyes and their connection to his death. He collects other brain-dead victims and he has a very high success rate because he gives off a curious, childlike aura that people find sweet and unthreatening. He's a really hard kid to dislike, but he does struggle with overcoming his fears from his past life, like walking on the ground. He's the only soul collector that hangs around with Mr. Bones on a regular basis, as Mr. Bones basically adopted the little guy as his son, whereas the other soul collectors are more like co-workers or distant relatives of him, at least according to him, though he does genuinely care about all of them. Mr. Bones, again, is a mysterious entity with no beginning or end. What he is isn't exactly known, but over the years he's learned every known language, he's documented every historical event in his mind, and he's capable of matching the mannerisms and clothing styles of any species he encounters. He's most commonly seen in a suit though, since he is, again, a savvy businessman. Here I wanted to make him look a little bit more sharp, and a little more inhuman in how angular he is. I went for a more Tim Burton-esque look to him in terms of exaggeration, but in hindsight, he's just a little bit too outside of my personal style to fit in with the rest of these characters. Here's a few notable features about Mr. Bones, though. He's got 4 arms, a more recent choice I went with to make him more of an entity than a person. His scythe contains a reference to a similar element of the universe to death, future. It has this purple eye, or at least it would be purple, showing that there's a connection between him and future events. There's a little soul peeking out of a hole in his hat, and here's my explanation for that. It's either meant to be the place he keeps souls or the place that he keeps his own soul. Either interpretation is fine, but I don't want to commit to either for the sake of allowing people to come to their own conclusions. Any and all accents to his coat would be a warm color gradient sort of thing. That was always the intention for him, and you may have noticed despite wearing a suit, he has no tie. The reason for that is that he is a business type, but he's not without a little bit of a rebellious side. He actually formed a band in the world of the living for a while called the Tombstones. It started out as him having an interest in learning ragtime music on the piano, but it kind of evolved when he switched over to playing the bass. That whole storyline was mostly a joke, but it was based on the sequel to Bill and Ted's Most Excellent Adventure, so yeah, I'm keeping it mostly for nostalgia. Mr. Bones is charismatic and versatile, able to become whatever a person needs him to be when they die. It's why Mr. Bones is usually the one taking care of more difficult or dangerous souls. Clara here is where I've been struggling for a long time. She's got a ton of story, some of it requiring quite a bit of rewriting, but here's the revised stuff you need to know for this story. Clara Barton is the daughter of Clarice Barton, a woman who is able to climb the social ladder through her wit, survival instincts, and through connections made over time. In a more recent revision, she was black, and seeing as she's from 1800s England, she clearly had her share of diversity. Clara's wealthy father was killed by Clarice, a story for another day, and both Clarice and her daughter fell ill to a mysterious virus, assumed to be yellow fever years later. Yet another story for yet another time. Clara became stuck in the death realm, but her soul never actually left her body. She was essentially trapped with only Mr. Bones and Kano for company, and both of them became very fond of her. She eventually goes back to the living world, becomes a superhero, leads a revolution, dates a robot, becomes a figurehead for an espionage organization, becomes a villain that takes her father's name, just the usual insane nonsense that happens in all of my stories. But yeah, Clara was originally just the painfully shy girl, which is something I want to change, and I have wanted to change for a while. Here she's the quiet courage type. She's a graceful bookworm that gets annoyed when people look down on her for her love of fine culture. She's patient and wise, considering she's been able to learn and grow for 200 years. Here she's serving time in the death realm for crimes that are part of another story, but she really does do a good job. I want her to look sweet and angelic, and that's why I went with the seraphim look to her in terms of wings. A seraphim has 8 wings on various parts of their body, and I tried to incorporate them into Clara's appearance. 2 wings on her hairpieces, 4 in the dress, 2 that would theoretically protrude from her back. So that's pretty much it for her. She's a very simple character personality-wise. The one thing I haven't been able to nail yet is the face. I always wanted her to have a longer and more mature face, despite her physical appearance as a 16-year-old, but it just ended up looking weird here. The eyes are too big, it doesn't fit with everything else, and it's gonna take me a while before her face is really reflective of her personality. Bear with me, guys. Anyway, she's as good with soul collecting as Mr. Bones himself, sometimes even better. She doesn't work for him long at first, but she does eventually return to the Death Realm to continue keeping her friend company. Kano here won't be getting much of a rewrite since I still think his story works. Like Watch, it's just a little bit more detail for him. He's a Benega, a skeleton of old legends, and his species is theorized to be the reanimated corpses of Celestials like Miss Multiverse and the Astral children from my past videos. His species was once a vast empire before being wiped out in a war against the demon race, and Kano is the last living Benega in existence. He was originally a caretaker for young children, but watching them being slaughtered by the demon race without a second thought broke his moral compass. He hunted down and tortured their killers, he stole often, he broke galactic laws to evade detection from the post-Demon War police for his crimes, and when he finally found his way to the Death Realm, he attempted to take down Mr. Bones to return the souls of his ancestors to their bodies, but was defeated in combat. Mr. Bones was merciful, allowing Kano to become his servant and collecting souls in exchange for a child, so Kano became Mr. Bones' first companion in the Death Realm. Kano's brash, combative, but still very good with children, making it difficult for deceased children or even parents to argue with him or hate him for his stormy disposition. He sees Mr. Bones as a father figure he never had, and though he doesn't trust the less predictable death for a long time, he accepts them as a second parental figure later on. For his redraw, I want to focus on making him a little bit more unique anatomy-wise. Unlike Mr. Bones or normal skeletons, he has no teeth, just warped melted holes over his mouth that allow him to communicate. He has horns, different shaped legs, he's thinner, and all of that was to make him a skeleton, but not really. It's hard to explain. But I also had him dressed in a tunic sort of thing with some armor. He wears the traditional clothing of his ancestors, or at least what's left of their clothing. Not only is he a representation of their history, but he's also a representation of their extinction. He's got cracks in his skull, charred tips to his limbs, and an X over his head. In the end, he'll give up his soul to continue his species in a new child, so he'll actually completely fade from existence once the child fully matures. He follows the pattern in my stories where my favorite characters die and just don't come back, but it's honestly one of the reasons why I like them is because their story is finite. Last thing for Kano, his axe contains the memories and the imprint of more difficult souls he's collected, so that's why there's little ghosties floating above his axe. The next two are the most brutal stories in my opinion. It's always the ones on the left, isn't it? I'll be calling them 1 and 2 until I come up with new names for them. They resemble these cute little anteater things called pangolins. They're really adorable, so naturally I made a species out of them. 1 and 2 are born as conjoined twins, with one, the smaller one, being parasitic. They suffered in coexistence together for a few years before they were forced to separate from each other when 2 started to become frail from the lack of nutrients getting to his body. Separating them killed both of them, but one feels responsible as the parasitic twin in death. Mr. Bones was the one to find them, and the fact that he lets them continue to live as fellow soul collectors is reflective of Mr. Bones' slightly softer side, as a result of his companions like Kano and Clara. 1 and 2 pick up diseased and child souls respectively because they're very gentle and good at cheering people up. 1 is quieter and a little bit more solemn because of the burden weighing on them, but they can be just as playful. As much as I like the idea of this species, I struggled to get the anatomy right, and that probably shows. As for death symbolism, 2 was hard to figure out. It's difficult to visually represent water or a lantern, so I just went with having the lantern hang from his prosthetic arm, and going with a kind of poncho vibe, since 1 usually wears a poncho when it's raining. 1 is a candle, which was definitely much harder. I gave them a tunic dress, a glowing eye, and a candle of their own to create the connection. The dress tunic thing drips eternally like wax, so their eye is kind of the candle wick. Since it glows, it sounds weird, I know, but what I think makes up for the weird design is the use of X's for these 2 characters. You may have noticed all of the X's on 1's body. For their symbolic cause of death, the X's are a substitute for the missing parts of their body that they lost when they fused with their brother. 2 wears a chain on his neck with the same kind of X since he died because he couldn't breathe in enough oxygen to support both of their bodies. So yeah, there's quite a bit of body horror in this child story, but they really are sweet and supportive of each other, and they keep going even when things get hard. The last character was definitely a hard one for me to combine the death symbolism and the character, so for this one I combined Wick and him with the shape and purpose of the former and the unpredictability of the latter. She's an unknown alien species from a planet that underwent an ice age. Now her species is specialized to endure warm temperatures and relies on sunlight for energy, possibly an ancestor to the Izakali. You can imagine what an ice age would do to the equivalent of a desert dweller. She starved to death while wearing the corpse of a wolf-like creature to stay warm, similar to Luke Skywalker on Hoth. She refused to eat the creature though because it protected her. Their bodies fused in death, kind of the opposite of 1 and 2, but very similar to Era, who fused with the flowers she died on. Like Era, she was not considered dead, so she couldn't go into the vault. However, what she was very unstable at first, similar to a wayward spirit. She has her own mild-mannered tendencies, but she also has the wildness of a wolf creature, making her vicious when aggravated. She, 1 and 2 are an inseparable pair, which unfortunately is something I only established after drawing the picture, so it might not be that clear here. This character's top-heavy with really thin legs and large paw-like hands. I imagine she sometimes travels on all fours or something just to balance out the weight. Her face is kind of where I struggled. It's this mask with wolfy features as well as the features she once had. That's why she kind of looks like a cow rather than a traditional wolf. And like 1 and 2, her clothing is a tunic sort of thing, somewhat Greek-looking. They all die during a very similar time period, as well as they are both desert creatures, so they wear very similar clothes. Other than that, I just toyed with a few things before I colored her fur black. She's a figure that lingers in the shadows where death is going to take place, and she picks up the souls of the hungry or otherwise neglected when actually doing her job. She has a firm hand with the dead, one of her best qualities when it comes to fulfilling her duties. However, she still struggles with her more animalistic instincts, especially her eternal hunger. So here we are, 8 more characters done, and let's introduce them again, under their new names. This time, in order from most to least dead, we have We all know that death is hard. I'm sure if you've lost a family member or a friend, you do know. It may not be much, but one of the goals of my subpar melodramatic stories is to comfort people and create a place where death, disease, genocide, and greed are real forces. But there are people that are there for you to help you through difficult times. Whether that's a homicidal brother letting his sister see the world in her last moments, whether it's an attention-seeking drum major finding friendship in their rival drum major, maybe even a patient, smiling face waiting for people beyond the veil, ready to take them into the next life. There is loss, pain, and suffering, but there is love in even the darkest places. That's why this story about death is certainly not a sad one. In this world, and hopefully ours, there is comfort and compassion if we're willing to look for it, represented in this unlikely family that was able to find life and purpose in the land of the dead. So here we are again, another 8 characters redrawn. The next redraw video will be more of an extension of the last video about the Astral family, but a little bit more world-building-y like this one. I plan to do a few more like this, with some movie reviews thrown in every now and again. You can expect that around May, but I may be MIA this upcoming week because of a certain theater production running from April 28th to 30th. I'm excited and terrified at the same time, since it's hard to see the end of the tunnel from here, but I have faith in our cast and crew, and I'll do my part as stage manager when the time comes. As for June, well, I want to celebrate Pride Month with the next major story we're going to be talking about. Chardonnay and Clova, or as I like to call it, the unwritten space lesbian story. It'll be 2 videos, and I may do a follow-up video after that, so yeah. If that sounds fun to you, make sure to like and definitely subscribe if you want to get notified about those upcoming videos. At the time of recording this, I've got 75 whole subscribers. That's more than the number of people at school that probably know my name, so thank you so much, guys. If we get to 1,000, I can start using the community tab to get everyone's thoughts on videos that I should make. So I really can't wait for that. If it happens, this is all hypothetical, but I'm getting really excited about it. In all seriousness, I won't hold you any longer, so this is V for Verbatim, signing off until the next video. Take care, guys.